So my
Yes.
morning and evening and afternoon. Okay, guys, so it's time here in South Africa. Hello, everybody. I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dana Doan with her for our monthly talk. And she is doing, her topic is about experiencing nonprofit in Vietnam, a community engaged Q methodology study. Just a little bit about Dana. Well, I've met her at the Q conference last year, and it was just amazing for me, firstly, how intently she listened and paid attention to the way people spoke. And then when she spoke back, it was always so insightful. So Dana, you've made such an impression on me last year. So I'm really excited to be able to host this evening. So she has over 2 decades of work experience as a practitioner, consultant, and researcher with a variety of social purpose organizations in the USA, Southeastern Asia, and Latin America. In 2009, Dana helped establish the LIN Center for Community Development in Ho Chi Minh City to support the philanthropic efforts and initiatives of individuals and organizations working in Vietnam. Currently, she is a doctoral candidate at Indiana University, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, conducting a research in Vietnam. Her research interests include community-led development, community philanthropy, learning, monitoring and evaluation, social impact measurement, nonprofit management and justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. So all of this is social change, and she publishes, and she is just such an amazing speaker. So Dana, I am really glad to introduce you. Just for organization's sake tonight, if anybody has questions, if you want to pop it into the chat, and then at the end of the presentation, we will go through the questions. Thank you, Vivian. Will you share the screen with the slides, and then we can start.
Vivian, you're muted. Thank you, Rilla.
Yes, I was going to say, let me share my screen with everyone. And everyone, please let me know if you can see what I see. If not, we'll make it better. Okay.
Yes, we are seeing it.
Let me make it. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Oh,
it was right just now.
Yes, it was. There it is.
Yes,
let me just.
There it is.
Okay.
Fantastic.
There it is. Okay.
Wonderful.
Can everybody see? Yes. Now, Rola, will I be advancing the slides or you?
No, I can't because you're sharing it. So you need to.
All right, I'll advance the slides. So Dana, just give me the cue and I'll make sure I move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for letting me have this space to share my research. I shared a little bit of this at the Q Down Under, but it wasn't finished when I hadn't finished collecting the data. So now I get to share a complete version of my research. As indicated, the focus of my research is on what matters most to the people that nonprofits aim to serve. And I'm looking at the experience of nonprofits in Vietnam. The next slide, please. So to start, I just thought I should share a little bit about my kind of where I position myself in conducting this research. So I'm originally from the U.S., though I've been living in Vietnam since 2002. I have been working in nonprofits in the U.S., Latin America, and Vietnam, as Rola helped kind of introduce. And before coming to the doctoral program, I had joined a community called Measuring What Matters, and we were focused on social impact measurement in the nonprofit space. And I decided to pursue further studies to try and advance that work. I'm conversational in Vietnamese, but I'm not fluent, so I did have a research assistant working with me throughout my data collection process. Next slide. So the reason for conducting this study was that in the sector, the need to provide evidence of social impact has become a popular strategy that's used by nonprofits to both build and maintain public trust. But a lot of people working in the sector, as well as scholarship, has noticed that the way that nonprofits measure social impact, focusing primarily on program effectiveness, does not capture important impacts, nor does it capture the way that social change is actually achieved. At the same time, we see that there is a need in the nonprofit sector to better understand these organizations from the perspective of the people that nonprofits set out to serve, whereas the research focused much more attention on the staff and other external stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the research question that I used for my study was, how does an individual's first encounter with a nonprofit organization provider, nonprofit service provider, both as a potential and intended constituent of this organization, influence their experience and their decision to engage with the organization? I had two sub-questions. So the first focused on what organization factors influence an individual's experience? And the second focused on how. So how do those organizational factors influence their decision to engage with a nonprofit service provider? So I'm focusing on human service providers rather than any type of nonprofit organization. Next slide, please. And I wanted to just share with you the terms that I use, because they're not always the most popular terms, both in practice or in scholarship. But I use the term constituent to refer to individuals, families, and communities that a nonprofit human service provider sets out to serve. And I'm focusing on the first encounter. So the first time that somebody encounters a nonprofit, that period of time where they come into contact with a human service provider. And I'm very interested in their experience. So this is the primary focus of any type of qualitative research. And so I'm looking at the life world as it is lived, felt, undergone, made sense of, and accomplished by human beings. That is the object of study. Next slide, please. I looked at two key streams of literature, which I refer to as the organization encounters literature and the help-seeking literature. So actually, the organization encounters literature is comprised of two literatures: the service encounters literature, which comes from business management and services marketing. And this is kind of where I got the definition of the first encounter. But I also look at public, bureaucratic, and citizen encounters literature, and that comes from political science and public administration. That literature focuses more on specifically on the interaction between a citizen and the official as they conduct business together. And these two literatures explore two different theories: role theory and social interdependence theory, that looks at kind of the expectations people have coming into an encounter in their various roles as staff or as citizen or staff as customer. And social interdependence theory, that shows that they kind of work with one another and they're affected by the actions of the other. In the help-seeking literature, this literature begins by kind of exploring this practice of giving and receiving help, noting, from long historical practices that these are universal practices that help to create and maintain social ties, reinforce laws, and promote social stability. The literature emerges from social psychology, and there's studies on people's attitudes about help-seeking, their behaviors in help-seeking relationships, and their help-seeking outcomes. The theories most relevant are social exchange theory, which is connected to reciprocity theory, basic needs theory that talks about kind of human beings' basic needs for competence, a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy, and a sense of relatedness or belonging. Status theory, which talks about how people react to their felt positions, feeling self-supported or feeling threatened, and psychological reactance theory on how they might react when they feel that their needs are threatened. Next slide, please. So I provided kind of a visual of my takeaways from these two streams of literature. Kind of the first box describes kind of the key features of a first encounter that are noted in these literatures of what's important. And I bold like the socio-relational features, because that's really stressed, especially in the organizational and help-seeking literatures, about how important the relationship between particularly staff and constituents, but also the constituent and other people in that encounter. There's also administrative features of the encounter that affect participants. And they talk about kind of learning and compliance and psychological costs that they have when they face such administrative features. They talk about the service setting or the servicescapes or physical environment, having access or lack of access to information about what to expect or what the organization does, the experience of waiting and having supportive networks. And then there in the help-seeking literature, but both literatures, they talk about how people respond to these first encounters, both in terms of feelings as well as kind of behaviors. So what might become of the first encounter because of those feelings and features that they express. So actually taking up or engaging with a nonprofit, how they participate, their levels of participation, but also paying things forward or reciprocating the help, or how they feel health-wise, or their feeling of independence or dependence. Next slide, please. So the design of my study was a multi-phased community-engaged Q methodology study that took place in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And I'll start off by explaining why Vietnam. So on the next slide, I describe both the contextual interest in Vietnam, but as well as the practical interest. As I mentioned, I've lived here for almost 2 decades. So I had personal and professional relationships, but contextually, I find it to be a very interesting place to study nonprofits, given the long history and culture of mutual aid and practices of support for others, but also the ongoing challenges in developing a more formalized nonprofit services sector here. The public is largely unaware of nonprofit service organizations, and the government tends to be suspicious of these organizations. So it's less taken for granted here. So this is if you can go ahead and click through, I didn't mean to animate the slide, sorry, Vivian. This is my 4-phase study. I began with focus groups and in-depth interviews with a small number of domestic workers. Then we asked them to visit some of these women, but also new participants to visit a nonprofit of their choice and reflect, we had some reflection questions before, after, and then about a month and a half later. Those kind of the feedback through phase 1 and phase 2, along with my review of the literature, kind of helped me to estimate a concourse. And then I launched into my Q study for the 4th and final phase. I also had one more click. I had a community, a local advisory group. And so these were comprised of 3 women. I focused my study on women. This included a woman, a professional from a nonprofit who is also excellent translator and research assistant, Ms. Chuk, Ms. Huang Thi Tu Huyen, who was a domestic worker herself and agreed to support and engage with the study, and Ms. Wu Thi Quinn Zhao, who was a doctoral student, but also had experience working and volunteering with nonprofits. So I worked with them to kind of, get feedback on how I was implementing this research and throughout the study on when I was facing challenges in understanding what was going on or wanted to feedback with them. Next slide, please. So in building the Q sample, I mentioned my process. I started off with 477 statements. I used structured and naturalistic sampling to narrow that down to 49 statements. I coded all of my statements into categories and selected based on the principle of heterogeneity. After I conducted a pilot study, I decided to add 1 additional statement, so I ended up with 50 statements. Next slide, please. In recruiting the P set, I worked with women. I mentioned that I focused on women, adult women in Ho Chi Minh City. The reason for that was that from the literatures that I reviewed, women were more likely to seek help, but also more sensitive to the relational aspects of a service encounter. So that was the primary reason. Also, I'm a woman myself, and I wanted to make them feel safe and comfortable in my research and thought that I could understand them. The second kind of recruiting criteria I used was having prior experience of a nonprofit. I wanted women that both had prior experience of a nonprofit as well as women that did not. So for the group that did have prior experience, whether that was as I prioritized participants, constituents, but I also looked for volunteers, donors, and staff experiences, because some people had multiple types of experiences. So I investigated that to see what might be influencing their responses, but no prior experience. To recruit women of this group, I had a much more challenging time trying to reach out to women, but I used social media. We have a platform called Zalo here in Vietnam, Facebook, email, and just through trusted contacts and daily life activities. I was looking for variations, but I didn't sample on variations. I kind of seek out people based on that, but I was looking for people with various types of backgrounds. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a quick overview of my PSET, the 18 with prior experience and 14 women without, the type of occupations that these women held, their ages, religious background, and hometowns. So I did get women, a lot of women in Ho Chi Minh City come from other parts of Vietnam. It's almost like living in New York or another big city where very few people you meet are from there. Next slide, please. So for my method of data collection, these are two of my local advisors, this Ms. Chuk and Ms. Nguyen, demoing. This is during our pilot of the Q study. So they were sorting and debriefing with me and talking through things. We had paper and a big piece of paper that we carried around to coffee shops or conducted at my home. Next slide, please. I used the condition of instruction that was a hypothetical scenario, but I tried to make it as realistic as possible to both the setting in Vietnam, to the women I was with. So it was a hypothetical nonprofit serving women that I referred to as Hoa Cook Services. I distinguished it as being a nonprofit versus a business or a government service provider, and that it offered a variety of training, such as job training, healthcare, and offering assistance in other difficulties in people's work or life. And I asked them to imagine that they had just visited Hoa Cook the previous day, and today they're sorting these statements, reflecting on that visit, on what would make them most encouraged or most discouraged to return to the organization. Next slide. And this was kind of a Vietnamese version of the Q sort that they did. Next slide, please. I used for data analysis, I used CADE, the latest version that was available. I heard there's a new version coming out very soon, but this is an open source software. That was one of the primary reasons why I wanted to use it, because I could also teach it in Vietnam for others. And I used PCA and Verimax. I had to do some hand calculating of distinguishing consensus statements due to my high correlations, which I'll talk about later. And I interpreted the viewpoints using the factor arrays, composite Q sorts, and interview transcripts. So this is a picture of my factor loadings tables, factor score characteristics, and correlations. So I had seven defining sorts on factor 1, 5 on 2, and 3 on 3, but quite a lot of significant sorts on all 3. And as you can see, my factor score correlations were in the 0.5 area, but explain variance over 60%, and 1 null sort. Next slide, please. And the narrative was, this is how I described them in brief. The first is I call the mutuality viewpoint, women that are talking about feeling that they can work together with staff to address their problem. The second is about caring. They're looking for staff that are personally motivated towards helping them versus kind of having other agendas, or efficiency, that they can get what they need for help in a timely manner. So I'll describe each of these in more detail. Next slide. So for the mutuality viewpoint, there were 4 key themes. So I include here the statements and their position on the sort. So first theme was that these women are looking for services that are relevant and can be tailored to meet their specific needs. So they're looking for things that are useful to what they need. Customization is important, and kind of seeing people like themselves getting services from this organization. They find that the insights and input of constituents is welcome and appreciated. They want to feel that they're really being listened to, that they have a chance to provide feedback, that the staff are paying attention to them when they're having conversations, and that they're not being just bounced around. They definitely don't want staff to be making assumptions about them, but just why not ask? And that they understand the importance of why they need to learn how to help themselves. So the statement, staff help me to help myself, rather than doing things for me, or taking care of things for me and following my progress, was less important because they wanted to be more in control of their service. And I give a couple of quotes on the next slide to show you some of what people were talking about. So they want to feel that they're being listened to, and it helps me as the constituent reflect and think. It's okay to listen to me without giving me advice. Listening is more difficult. If you feel that people are listening to you, you will feel first that you are respected, and second, that you have more trust in the person listening to you. And I'll believe it when you listen to me. A second example is that the woman talked about getting the tools and methods, but the person that should be doing the work is me. It must be done in such a way that it makes me really strong. I'm strong, not you, not the staff. So if, for example, if I go there to be taught, like in Vietnam, they refer to this, the fishing rod, being more important than receiving the fish. Next slide, please. The caring viewpoint is staff being personally motivated and caring towards the constituent. There were 3 themes that I identified from this viewpoint. The first is that staff demonstrate they are intrinsically motivated to help constituents. So one of the words I kept hearing throughout all 4 phases was nhiệt tình, which is kind of roughly translated into English as enthusiastic. They're really motivated by their work, they care, they want to help. So that was coming up a lot in these conversations, but also the organization knowing how to provide caring services for people like me. So some people talked about having personal experience or lived experience with the issue that I'm facing, or observing that they help people that are in similar situation to myself, or hearing examples. So both visual and kind of overheard, but also being able to anticipate my needs and kind of work proactively to reduce my burdens and stress. They talk about staff work to try to make it easier for me to seek help, or they don't require a referral to get help. They'll make it kind of facilitated, or not having too many procedures, things like that. A couple of quotes to illustrate the caring viewpoint are on the next slide. So they talk about love. So when people come to this organization, the people are very sincere. There's no self-interest, there's just love. When I see that, I'll have faith. When they do this job, they must always be ready with a cheerful and open spirit to receive and bring the most necessary help to the person in need. It must be a thoughtful person, someone who loves others, has a compassionate heart. If this service is to be successful, it must be very humane in the world, in society. On the next slide, I'll briefly summarize the efficiency viewpoint. So this is about kind of the organization, the professionalism, and the timeliness of the support. A lot of times these women talked about not having time to spend a lot of time with a nonprofit and wanting to get things done. So a preference for staff being prepared and following the procedures, and there being some sort of like orderliness in the organization. So they talked about clarity in the answers, the office being not being disorganized, staff knowing how to help. So rather than lived experience, these people felt like similar beliefs and or values, or like having those in common will be important and kind of expedite the service. Or having more education and experience. These were distinguishing statements. And staff facilitating the process of receiving help. So giving advice before checking with a manager or someone higher up, that was appreciated as a way of kind of getting things done, whereas kind of the other viewpoints wanted thoroughness and kind of care and kind of people being involved in checking. And here it was about taking care of me, following my progress, kind of making it work for my process. So there's one kind of longer quote on the next slide describing this viewpoint. So sometimes I ask staff for a question, but they just answer according to a procedure. The procedural answer is to do this step and this step. Only then will I receive a final answer. I shouldn't have to go around from one person to another to get an answer to this question. It's a waste of time for both of us. Many times, even when I ask the right person, they don't give me the answer I expect. I think employees who work for social related service not only have to be good at their technical jobs, but should also know how to answer questions and understand people's needs. And one more thing, some people will ask the right questions, but not everyone is like that. Some people don't know that question to ask. Next slide, please. So kind of how does this pertain to my research and my research questions? Next slide, please. So on my first question, as I mentioned, I was looking at what organizational features influence an individual's experience when visiting a nonprofit service provider. And I identified 4 dimensions of effectiveness. This came from the Q sample and how it was interpreted. But there was the relational dimensions of effectiveness, where there was a lot of comments about the character, the nature, or the temperament of the staff. Or the power or authority that the individual has in the encounter. Does the staff have more power? Does the constituent have it? Having a sense of privacy, how services are personalized or not, and some sort of shared social identity, like lived experience or beliefs or values or age or education, things like that. The second dimension is technical dimensions. So this refers to like the staff or the organization having resources, the desired result that they expect from the service, the reputation or the track record of the organization, either from their observations or from what they've heard in advance. Then there's the accessibility dimensions, which a variety of different aspects of costs or administrative burdens. And then there's a category I called other because they didn't quite fit together, but several comments about service settings, the physical environment, or how their friends or family would respond, or the opportunity to reciprocate the support. Next slide, please. And so visually, I tried to show kind of like how this works. You know, in the focus groups and in the site visits, I heard a lot of people's impressions who had never been to a nonprofit before, what they were expecting and kind of how that influences their viewpoints, but also their attitudes towards help seeking, like what they imagine, not just why they would want to go to get help and what they would hope from a more formal helping relationship. So those influence how they encounter these 4 dimensions of effectiveness, and that then influences whether they decide to engage cautiously or not engage at all. And so in my next slide, I refer to the second sub-question, which is how do the organization features influence an individual's decision to engage? So to look at this, I kind of tried to create a visual of these 4 dimensions of effectiveness. So I looked at the top 6 and top 6 and bottom 6 statements, and kind of from how they fit into these dimensions of effectiveness. And you can see from the top 6 and top bottom most influential statements that relational dimension of effectiveness is quite important regardless of the viewpoint. But if you look at like what aspects of the relational, you know, which statements they actually pointed out, there was a little bit of overlap, maybe 1 or 2 of the kind of top 6 statements, but not all of them. They were different in the way that they cared about it. And then for the other 3 dimensions, they organize differently. For some, it's the technical priority. For others, it's accessibility. But also the statements differ. So that to me shows you that for each person, there will be a difference. Not everybody is the same. Constituents are not the same, but that there are some commonalities, particularly when it comes to the relational dynamics. And then if you click one more time, I did hear some feelings that people had, you know, in these 3 viewpoints, but I didn't test for this. So these are just kind of the next step of what I'd like to look at. But the mutuality viewpoint was bringing up aspects of autonomy and competence and feelings of being competent or feeling inferior. For the caring viewpoint, they were talking about feelings of belonging or feeling different or feeling supported or not feeling supported. And whereas the efficiency viewpoint, the comments that were coming up was about satisfaction and dissatisfaction. For all 3, they were talking about respect or disrespect, some of these these 12 most influential statements. So this is something that I'd like to explore more because I think that this is either a moderator or a mediator for these outcomes. Next slide, please. So for my implications, I think what is clear is that relational work matters. This actually extends what we found in the organization encounters and the help-seeking literature, extends it to the nonprofit literature. Relational work matters, but is often taken, it's not a key part of the way we measure or the way that we envision nonprofit work. So this is something that is important. And constituents, they share some similarities and differences in their preferences for engagement with a nonprofit service provider. And finally, that comparing stakeholder impressions regarding the role of nonprofit service providers will be important. Hearing how constituents think about the first encounter versus how staff or how donors or how policymakers envision that to be. And for my limitations, you know, I talk about how this Q study, my Q study, is generalizable to views of women. I focused on women and I focused on nonprofit human service providers. And while there's no such thing as a perfect Q sample, you know, I did feel that there was, I gave participants blank cards that they could kind of write in if they felt that something was missing. Most of them said they felt it was sufficient, but I did receive about half of the women when I encouraged them to share some other statements. And And although most of them looked like a statement already on the board, there was some that were unique. So I do wonder if this could have been done even better. And in terms of PSET, is there a missing viewpoint? I think that the viewpoints, when I shared them back in a validation meeting with participants, they resonated. But at the same time, there was, as I mentioned, it was harder to recruit people without prior experience of a nonprofit. And I wonder if those people that didn't participate in my study might have another viewpoint that I'm missing here. And, you know, the aspect of social desirability bias, there was some incomplete or unclear responses. But I was able to overcome some of this through member check meetings. And I felt I chose a situation, hypothetical scenarios to make people feel more comfortable. They could, it wasn't as stigmatized services as some nonprofit services could be. But that can always be an issue. And in terms of researcher subjectivity, that can be a strength if I used it well, because I have past experience with nonprofit sector. So just being able to distinguish between, you know, my prior expectations and how that might enable a successful interpretation, or, you know, if some of my prejudices influence that. I talk a little bit more about that in my research. But those are some of the things that I reflected on. And finally, I wanted to thank a lot of people in this room for their support on the next slide, and kind of advice, because this is Q-Sort was brand new to me when I was doing my dissertation. A couple of people really went above and beyond to help support me, Dr. Amanda Wolf and Dr. Diane Montgomery. Thank you so much. But also everybody in the Zoom Q community, the QRG community from Asia, and the Q Method list service. Dr. Sue's Ramlow's YouTube tutorials were invaluable, but also the many email postings on the Q Method list service that some of you responded to, and I got very detailed responses from Dr. Brown, and I really appreciate that. So I welcome your questions and comments further on my research. Thank you.
Wow. Applause. That was fantastic, Dana. Well done. And I see there are quite a few people who have joined, so we're very, very happy. Shoo, this was interesting. There are a few questions. So, Nico, I see you've posted yours. Do you want to read your question? And then maybe we can go, and then we'll take hands afterwards.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Dana. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was super insightful. So firstly, I just said your hypothetical use of, your hypothetical condition of instruction was super interesting, because I've only been here around for maybe a year and a half, and I haven't come across a paper that starts off with a hypothetical situation, particularly in a nonprofit situation, because sometimes what happens is people will focus on, if you use the real nonprofit, they'll focus on the nonprofit instead of speaking about what you're investigating. So that was super interesting. And then my first question is, in relation to the mutuality viewpoints, are nonprofits in Vietnam actually tailoring services to community members, or for community members rather?
Yeah, I mean, so the participants in my study for the hypothetical, they didn't actually have to know that. But yes, some of them do, and some of them are more a standardized operation. And that was kind of one of the things that drew me to further study and kind of investigate social impact, because sometimes the standardized operation, that sometimes we can refer to them as people processing nonprofits, are viewed favorably by donors. But when you're kind of involved in the organization, or a frontline worker or social worker, you're very concerned about the long-term impacts. It might be short-term effective, but not long-term effective. And then you see the ones that are providing more customized or tailored services, or going slower with the participant. They tend to struggle with kind of the donor fundraising support, but then they tend to have more promising outcomes in the long term. So we were looking at, that's one of the kind of dynamics that I was seeing, that certain aspects, like the efficiency viewpoint by some stakeholders, might be viewed and differently. But yeah, I mean, there's a variation of the way that organizations, that some of them might call themselves a people changing organization or a people processing organization, you know, serving meals versus kind of changing mindsets. So you have the whole variety, just like you do in other countries. There's not that many nonprofits in Vietnam, I should caveat.
When I came up to the
but-
door.
Sorry,
Mm.
No,
you heard someone talking.
Oh, that's
somebody
somebody
not
else.
muted.
Cool. And sorry for hogging. Can I ask a question too? Sorry.
Yes.
What was your experience of using the word viewpoint instead of factor when you were describing your sort of composite factor arrays?
I just tried to, I've seen that used before. It wasn't like I invented it, but I also feel like it's more human term. So like kind of trying to kind of relate it back to the people, the participants involved. It wasn't, you know, in my head, I was mixing up the two, but in my writing and in my presentation, I just try to refer to it as viewpoint.
Cool. Awesome. That's all from me.
I hope that's right too.
That is wonderful. And it's quite interesting for me that the word viewpoint humanize people more as well. And using the word constituent, I think, gives people more respect. So just by using those terms, I think you've done what many, in my experience, nonprofits do not do successfully. So that I think is that why you use the word constituent?
Yeah, there's a lot of argument in the nonprofit literature right now about the term. Most of it is dominated by beneficiary or service user, but there's been a lot of comments and suggestions that those are not the right terms. And it puts them in a very passive role. And that's why the literature also doesn't really lift up their voices, tends to prioritize staff voices or government policymaker voices over constituents. So yeah, that was an intentional decision because of that concern.
Really respect. Rita has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. That has been an amazing presentation, very clear, linear. I really like the way in which you set up the study and develop it. My question is in the interpretation phase, you presented the viewpoints, which, by the way, I agree with you in choosing viewpoints, the term. And you said that you identified themes inside these three viewpoints. My question, it's kind of a technical question. Did you come out with new themes inside each viewpoint, or those themes that you reported, they come from the themes in the concourse that you brought in the Q set?
Mm. Yeah, the way that I structured the Q set was by categories. So I actually did that before I reviewed the help-seeking literature. I had only reviewed the organization encounters literature at that time. So some of that was in my mind about kind of what kind of features of an organization might come up. And when I recognized it, I would give it a similar category title, but it wasn't a theory or a theme, but it was a kind of a feature. So those categories were like staff demeanor, control, privacy, things like that. Whereas the themes were kind of how the statements were connecting and what they were saying kind of as they connected or disconnected. So that's how I came up. I wasn't drawing from themes intentionally from the literature, but there were some that resonated from the literature.
So the themes that you reported in the viewpoint interpretations, because you have these titles, and then you reported some statements with the score. Those heading, let's call heading. Did you elaborate them after the as a way to summarize the interpretation of the viewpoints, or you picked this heading from, for example, of also the themes that you said you developed for the Q sort and then brought inside Q set, Q sample.
I think I understand, but please interrupt if I'm not understanding. But so from the statements, I started to see like the distinguishing statements that were kind of connected in some way. And then I would try to imagine what is that connection.
Oh, I see.
And that's what I came up with the theme. And so then I would describe, I'd start with what does this theme mean? What do I think it means? And then how are these statements scores, the scores for each statement on that factor, explaining the connection to that theme. So that's how I elaborated it.
Am I understanding then, Dana, that there were sort of emerging themes, and that through your abduction, that's actually your complete interpretation part of it.
Yes.
Is there another question, or can I quickly sneak one in? Okay, so my question is, do you think your study support more what are those two categories of literature that you called the
Organization encounters and help seeking?
Yeah. Where do you think do the findings and interpretation of your study fit in most?
I think that I'm bringing the findings to showing that there's relevance of those findings to the nonprofit sector, nonprofit literature, one, but also so in the help seeking literature, a lot of it is about informal help, though there are some formal help. A lot of that focuses on health and psychological support and kind of medical support. So it's just kind of a more formal organization, a nonprofit or human service provider, kind of addition to that literature, not adding anything any greatly new. To the nonprofit literature, I'm showing that we're greatly under theorizing the relational value, the relational dynamic in the way we measure social impact, but also in the way we conceptualize what nonprofits do. There's background on nonprofits having expressive roles, which are relational, about this like connectedness, or instrumental roles. And a lot of the focus of the research is on the instrumental role. And so, kind of bringing back that expressive role that nonprofits play might be important given the findings of the importance of it. Also, what I found really fascinating in my focus groups and the reflections that participants made on their visits, their actual visits, was that so many of them talked about, I said, like the enthusiasm of staff, the loving, the caring, this expectation, those that had never visited a nonprofit before, this expectation that nonprofits would be more kind of caring, more loving, more human. And they don't have that same expectations for government service providers or for business service providers. So this difference between them. So being cognizant of those differences, being aware of that and how that might affect kind of outcomes when people have certain expectations about the organization. So I hope, did I answer your question, Rolla?
Yes, that's profound, I think, because you clearly show how your study would add to the literature, and maybe show a new direction. I think that is fantastic. Wow, well done. And I just want to compliment you on so clearly taking us through a very, very complicated study. I think this narrative and the way you told it is going to be perfect for your defense. Could I maybe ask if people who have been involved in defenses maybe want to give Dana some advice on how to prepare for a defense, or how could she add, or any comments from the gurus in the team, please? Well, it seems it was perfect, Dana.
I don't believe that.
Any other questions, or can I? We have 15 minutes to go, so I have a whole list of other questions to ask. But I just want to check if anybody else has said something. No, there's nothing on the chat.
No,
I see
Nico
Nico has a
has
question.
another question.
Oh yes, Nico, please.
Sorry, Dr. Dana, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that nonprofits in Vietnam are not trusted by the people, or actually not, sorry, not trusted by the government. Is there sort of a reason beyond, the sort of obvious kind of, funneling funds through nonprofits to a country type of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a long history in Vietnam of kind of foreigners using nonprofits, including the U.S. government, for policy agenda reasons. And so that was discovered in, during the wars, the Civil War in Vietnam, and there's been, concerns and efforts. And when I was engaged, there was definitely I was being tracked regularly by the police. So that's like a normal thing, but it's also not abnormal in Vietnam. It's not like only Vietnam does this. This is common in quite a lot of countries, so, and increasingly so of late. Looking at this globally, there's a common concern about foreign influence of nonprofits, but there's also, the difference in a positive angle. The government in Vietnam sees them being responsible for social welfare, and why would there be a need for nonprofits to provide it? Because we are kind of taking on that. So they have a very extensive network of mass organizations that they kind of would call their nonprofits, even though they have staff paid to implement these, broadly networked in every province: women's union, youth union, farmers union, Fatherland Front, labor unions. They've got all of these kind of mass organizations that are meant to provide and protect for social welfare needs. So it was that, are we saying that then they're not doing their job? And so some aspect of that is involved. But there has been a trend globally in the past decade of kind of increasing concerns about nonprofits and having like a political agenda rather than just a social, environmental, or kind of support agenda.
That's an excellent question. Are you happy, Nicole?
Yes, thank you.
And then there's a question from Nuri Akhtar Danesh. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, you did greatly. Thank you, Dana, for the excellent presentation. I just have some question, basically some clarification. The slide that you had with your numbers, how many loaded on each factor. Can I see that slide, please, again?
Sure.
Let me share the slide again.
I can
Please.
do it, Vivian.
Okay, good. Very good. Thank you.
Oh, sure. So just to clarify, how many participants did you have?
There was 32 women. I include in these sorts my own and also my research assistants sort are in here. So there's 34, but there are a total of 30.
So in your table, you have significant source 22, 21, 26. Are some people loaded in both factor? Because the total is obviously more than 34 or something.
Yeah, so as you can see, for example, P44, which I'm pointing to, I don't know if you see the pointer. There's the defining sorts where there was 7, 5, and 3 defining sorts, and then there was quite a few people that loaded on more than one. So I refer to those as the confounded sorts, and that was roughly more than about half of the participants sorted on more than one.
All right.
There was one person that sorted on that had significance on all 3.
Okay, and by significant you mean?
So I used that the calculation of the inverse of the number of statements, and multiplied that at the 0.01 level. So it was 0.365. But to determine defining sorts, I increased the level to 0.4. So that I could see differences.
Okay. Okay, so basically your groups are not independent from each other. You have the same people loading on 3 factors or 2 factors.
But not for the defining sorts.
Okay.
So, may I ask, with other words, just to clarify for myself, you did not use the confounded sorts when you created the viewpoints?
Correct.
Okay, right. So it's only shown here in the factor loadings, but not in the actual viewpoints. Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No follow-up question on that?
No, thank you.
Wonderful.
For some reason, I don't know why. They're kind of clear.
Fantastic. So, guys, we have 10 minutes left. So, I actually wanted to ask Charles to tell us, what do you see? What have you, sorry, it's a bit of a teacher coming in here. What are you learning from this presentation? How can you implement this in your own study?
I think that perhaps the most relevant fact, like part of it for me at this point, is the factor analysis stuff. I am not entirely familiar with factor analysis generally, let alone using like CADE and like the eigenvalues and stuff like that. I think that the ability to use I guess to lean most heavily on the defining sorts is going to be a strategy that, I mean, obviously it's fairly common, but when I set out to do this for the first time, I didn't realize that that was, I guess, an option. I assumed that I had to be able to incorporate every sort into some element, like into some factor or another, which was concerning for me because I was afraid that I was not going to be able to do that. So using only the defining sorts is, I think, going to have to be my approach as well, because I'm dealing with music fans. So of course there's going to be a lot of, I guess, overlap and stuff like that. And the strongest, most clearly defined sorts are going to have to be the center of my analysis. I think that that's probably the most important element. And then also how the sorts were done. I would like to, I'm not sure, perhaps run that back and look at it again, because I'm still kind of gathering bits and pieces of information as far as how to properly analyze the factors or viewpoints. So I think that those two elements are probably going to be most relevant to me at this point.
Excellent.
Yeah, definitely.
I would just say, Charles, that I wish that more of my sorts were, defining. It would, and I think it would have also addressed the higher correlations. So I think it's better if there's more of the sorts, defining sorts, than what I ended up with. But I think my understanding, and I'd love for some of the more experienced methodologists on the call to help both of us. But my understanding is that, the null sorts are more problematic. To have null sorts would be more concerning. I had one, but that's, you always want somebody to be significant on at least one viewpoint. But I'd love for others to interrupt. I see Nori's hand is up.
Yes, Nori.
Yeah, I'm sorry. In follow-up to, I hope I'm not taking anyone else this time. In follow-up what Charles said and my previous question, honestly, I haven't worked with CADE and I don't know how it calculates the loading sort on factors. But for my experience so far, we assume that factors are orthogonal mathematically and therefore mathematically independent from each other. Having one person loading on more than one factor, it obviously violates that assumption. So your factors are not independent from each other. And that might, if you just remove that confounding source from your factor, that may change the your distinguishing statements completely. I'm saying it might do it. It may not make much change, but that's worth of investigation as well. So that's my takeaway from that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm thinking of when Diane pulls out her slinky, or whatever you call that thing. And I think Sue once spoke about that we are all a little bit of everything else. You know, a little bit like, is it Einstein that says there's a bit of us that is smeared thinly in the whole of the universe. So and I think actually that's what I so love about Q methodology, is that it's not the tick of box. It is the humanity of people actually sometimes being two things at the same time or three things at the same time, because it's for that moment when they did that sort. If it was 10 days later, it might have been different. So, but it is a way of capturing the true humanity and complexity of what we are when we give our opinions or what we think. And I think that is amazing. I just want to, we've got 4 more minutes, but I just want to say, Dana, I think it's about 3 months ago, Renata asked a question about how people visualize their findings. And I just loved the way you did those blocks. It was just so clear. So there's the aspects that people agree with, but then there's this, and it just made sense for me immediately. So I think that's very innovative. And what do you think, Renata? Agreed.
From a teaching perspective, going a little bit back to what was the question? Oh my God, I'm embarrassed. I can't call names. Oh, what Charles was asking. Charles, I just want to know, are you clear on what defining sorts are telling us versus what confounding sorts are telling us? Are you clear on that? Because for my a person new to Q, that was the thing that was in my head when I first started looking at this methodology. So my question is, are you clear about what the sorts are telling you?
The defining sorts, definitely. The confounding sorts, what I took away from it is essentially what had been said before, that confound people who submit confounding sorts, it's not because they don't fit into any of the category or any of the viewpoints that are being analyzed. It's because they fit into multiple of the viewpoints that are being analyzed. And that, I mean, presumably, depending on the study, conclusions can still be drawn from that, or at the very least, they can be analyzed and used to support other conclusions. It's just not that it's quite as clean a fit as people who very obviously and clearly fit into one viewpoint. Is that a fair analysis of, I guess, the role of confounding sorts generally?
That is a question I wish to pose to our esteemed experts on this panel here.
So the surnames are Ramlow, Brown, Wolf. Where's Diana's surname? Montgomery.
Yes, we need to hear from you guys, please. Enlighten us further.
Not this morning, it seems. But that...
Don't make me call names, Dr. Ramlow.
Yeah.
I would say that yes, that's an excellent summary of confounded sorts on factors.
Well done, Charles. So, guys, I think maybe what we could do is we have 1 minute. So can I ask you, just so that we can get some social media insights from here, if you could maybe just post in the chat what is the aspect that you want, that you take out from this presentation, and then I will make sure to give that to Dana and type that up and send it through to her. And we'll do it with that waterfall story, where
Yes.
if you're ready, so quickly type up what impressed you or what surprised you. I'll give you 20 seconds. Okay, so we're ready. 1, 2, ready, go. Oh, that's interesting. That's wonderful. Hypothetical condition of instruction. Awesome. Clarity and delivery was excellent. Yes, let's give a last round of applause for Dana. Dana, this was super, super amazing. I thank you for the effort and presentation. And this is what, at 3 o'clock in the morning? Commendable, really commendable. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you again. Dana, do you want to maybe add a sentence on how was the presentation for you? Are there questions you have that you would like to post people after the presentation?
Oh my gosh, I have a million questions. I don't think there's time now, but yeah, I have a lot of insecurities about the Q study and the high correlations. So I just appreciate being able to share it with all of you before I share it in my defense, and try to prepare for those questions. So this was helpful raising some of the, concerns about confounded sorts and how to talk about them. So I really value this space, being a new Q methodologist. So thank you all again. And I may reach out to you with an email.
Absolutely. That was really fantastic. Thank you, everybody. And then we'll end the call. There you go. Bye-bye.
Very good job. Yeah.
Dana, Sam, for just a second, if you could, and also Rola, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you, Dana.